From the Biological Psychiatry family of journals, this is the Biological Psychiatry Podcast, where we discuss the latest research on psychiatric disorders and their treatments. Thank you for joining us. I'm your host and social media editor, Elvisha Dhamala. Pregnancy is widely recognized as a time of profound physical changes, but the brain undergoes equally dramatic transformations during this time. These neurobiological changes prepare birthing parents for the demands of caregiving and help establish the foundation for parent-infant bonding. However, pregnancy is also a time of heightened vulnerability, not just physically, but economically and physiologically as well. Financial stress during pregnancy is common, but we're only just beginning to understand how economic instability might affect the developing parental brain. Today, we're exploring groundbreaking research that examines how income changes during pregnancy influence brain responses to infant cues in the early postpartum period. Joining me is Dr. Pilyoung Kim from the University of Denver, first author of a recent paper in Biological Psychiatry, Cognitive Neuroscience and Neuroimaging. Dr. Kim, welcome to the Biological Psychiatry Podcast.
Yes, thank you so much for having me.
Pregnancy involves brain changes that prepare individuals for parenthood. Can you tell us what's actually happening to the brain during pregnancy and the early postpartum period to prepare for caregiving?
Sometimes I think it's a surprise to people that it's not just the body that changes so drastically during pregnancy and early postpartum period. The brain also changes drastically during this period. But there's very interesting differences what happens during pregnancy versus during the early postpartum period. So during pregnancy, across several studies, actually across different countries, what researchers have seen was that the people's brain overall, the size and the structure decrease. Another word, it shrinks actually a little bit over the course of pregnancy. But people should not worry because we think that it's actually good thing that's happening because that changes that happens during pregnancy, that specific brain regions that go through this structural reorganization seem to support people's parenting and their emotional bond with their baby after they have their baby during the postpartum period. So you can kind of think of it as this structural reorganization is that the brain is just kind of like reorganizing itself to make sure that, any connections that it doesn't need, it just kind of cut it away and clean it away so that there's actually more room to create more connections. We call pruning. We also see this happening a lot during adolescent period. And it's so interesting that during pregnancy, individuals are actually experience this as well in the brain, so that the brain is ready for the very important experience that people are very excited about when they actually welcome their baby. So what happens when they welcome their babies then that people often go through quite intensive period to care for their baby. And this provides, very enriched experience of parenting and very critical for them to kind of build that foundation of deep, deep emotional connections with their baby. And this seems to actually help and support creating new brain connections. So during about the 3 to 6 months postpartum across the studies that's been published, including the ones that our research team that, there are actually growth in the brain in very similar regions that actually show the shrinkage during the pregnancy. That now we see the growth and new connections in this brain that seems to be very important for people to be parent and have this very strong emotional tie with their babies.
So shifting into that aspect of parenting, your paper focuses on how the brain responds to infant cry sounds. Why are those brain responses to cry sounds so important, and how does that provide an insight into parental adaptation and bonding?
So we, as a researcher, would love to actually measuring people's brain activations while they're interacting with their babies in real time. But to be able to use the specific brain imaging technique, which is fMRI, the participants are very limited in their ability to move around. So the best way to actually creating very similar experience is for us is that when parents are inside the fMRI scanner, which takes like 3D images of the brain and record brain activation, we play infant cry sound, kind of simulating their parenting experience. So it is not real parenting experience, but it's close. And because infant cry is very, very emotionally salient, important cues from infants because infants cannot talk. So what can they do when they need attention from parents? They cry, right? So it's very salient and powerful signals from infant that grabs parents' attention right away. So we found that over and over across many, many studies that when we play infant cry, parents' brain activates very strongly. And those brain regions that sensitively responds to infant cry are also very involved in those responses that parents show in their behaviors, right? So typically when we have our baby cry, parents run to them, pick them up and sing a song and trying to really kind of do their best effort to kind of console them, right? And the moment when baby really seem to be happy and calm down and stop crying, that is also a moment for parents. They feel happy. So all of those are reflected in brain activations in also specific brain regions that are being activated. So including parental motivation brain regions. So people to be like motivated to care for infants, right? So it's very important brain regions being activated. The other brain region is emotion regulation brain region. So it's very important for parents to be regulating their own emotional reactions and really focusing on understanding babies' cues. Why is my baby crying? Is she hungry? Does she want diaper change? So we also another group of brain regions that we see to be very strongly responding to infant cues, cry cues, is this theory of mind, empathy, social cognition regions. And then when we actually have a chance to see parent participants interacting with their own baby. And then when we're analyzing those behaviors for their warm and sensitive care levels, the higher brain activations in these brain regions that I just mentioned tend to be related to more sensitive, more caring, more warm behaviors they show when they're interacting with their baby.
So, most research on socioeconomic factors in parenting focuses on poverty or overall income level, but your study took a very different approach, focusing on income changes, both in terms of gains and losses. Can you tell us why income instability is potentially more important and valuable to look at than just income level?
Our lab actually showed that the poverty level during pregnancy and early postpartum period do have impact on parents' brain activation to infant cry and also their parental sensitivity to infant cry, largely related to the stress that parents experience due to living in poverty that leads to like a lower brain sensitivity to infant cues. Stress can do that to the brain. So we were very concerned about poverty itself. And that's why NIH has funded our study to really focusing on that. As we're conducting this longitudinal study to looking at the impact of exposure to poverty during pregnancy, on parental brain responses to infant cry, we also notice in our sample that it's not just the low income level that is stressful, but the changes in income reported to be quite stressful experience among our pregnant individual participants. So we found it to be very interesting. And then there are some more growing number of literature suggesting that these very unpredictable, unstable situations in the environment can create a really high level of stress. So, I could kind of make a contrast in this case that during pregnancy, if I have low income, I am unsure whether I can pay the bill at the end of the month. I don't know whether I have enough food until the end of the month. So that is very stressful. But it's also something that I can kinda plan because I know how much income I have. But if I suddenly lose a lot of income, that brings shock into my experience. Suddenly, I really need to figure out a whole range of things that I used to be able to pay rent. I can't, right? I have to find a new job. So all this kind of changes seems to be a whole like another range of the stress that people are experiencing. I do have to mention though, unfortunately, it is also true that people who living in lower income tends to experience more instability in their incomes as well. So they're not completely separate. Also, when we actually looking at non-human animal research, often the way that the researchers creating very stressful experience during pregnancy to looking at the impact of stress during pregnancy on the maternal brain or the fetal brain, they often use this very unpredictable stress paradigm. So that was also another reason that we thought in human experience, the income changes and income instability comes close to that type of experience.
So, would it be accurate to say that it's not just stress, it's also stress unpredictability that plays a big role?
Exactly, exactly.
So, you measured income using the income to needs ratio rather than just raw household income. Can you explain what that ratio is and why it's a more accurate way to assess economic well being?
Yes. So there's just kind of average annual income. And then there's income to needs ratio. So income to needs ratio is calculated based on annually adjusted federal poverty line. So that is also decided by each state and by like specific household members. So whether there are two adults and two children or just the one single person, that the poverty line is adjusted accordingly. And if there's a 1-to-1 ratio, the income to needs ratio will be 1. If their annual income will be half of the family at the federal poverty line, the income to needs ratio for that family will be zero point 0.5. And typically, poverty is defined by income to needs ratio below 1. And low income status is typically defined by income to needs ratio below 2.
So, in this study, it was a prospective study that followed pregnant individuals from pregnancy through the postpartum period. You've already told us a little bit about the imaging session that was conducted. Can you tell us what exactly participants were listening to in the scanner and what you were measuring in response to what they were listening to?
So before the participants come to the fMRI session, we ask participants to record their baby's cry sounds, typically during the diaper change. So fun fact that parents can actually distinguish the baby's cry sounds, whether baby is in pain or, hungry or diaper change. But diaper change is just about pretty like average intensity in terms of infant cry. So we ask participants to record their own baby cry, and we actually have another matched infant cry sounds we call control sound. So that is also someone else's baby's cry sound during diaper change, which has about that average intensity across the people. So when participants come to the fMRI session, while they're inside the fMRI scanner, they listen to two different types of infant cry sounds. One is their own baby cry sound, and then the other is that control unknown baby cry sound. And what we're looking for is the overall their brain response to baby cry sound, but more specifically the differences between when they're listening to their own baby cry sound versus the unknown, unfamiliar baby cry sound.
What did you discover about the relationship between prenatal income losses and the actual postpartum brain responses to the infant cries?
Yes. So we wanted to see, especially the income losses. So the income instability can be conceptualized in both directions income losses and income gains. The literature generally suggests any changes can be stressful, but it's not hard to imagine for the audience that income losses will be a bit more stressful than income gains, and that's been shown in the literature that income losses can be linked to more negative health outcomes. So we expected that income losses, more specifically, can have much greater impact on parental brain responses to infant cry sounds when we actually also control for their average income level during pregnancy. So, what we're looking for is the specific link between the income losses that occurred throughout the pregnancy and postpartum parental brain response to infant cry above and beyond the impact of the average income level during pregnancy. And what we saw was that the more number of income losses that pregnant individuals experienced was related to the lower brain responses to infant cry in quite number of, I think there were like a 10 different brain regions, and those regions, including some of those functions that I mentioned before, like empathy, like processing the meaning of infant cues, as well as some regions that are related to emotion regulations. And then, in addition to the brain findings, we also saw that the higher number of the income losses were related to higher depressive and anxiety symptoms during pregnancy. So it seems to kind of supporting that individuals, when they're experiencing a lot of changes in their income, especially losing income, makes them feel more depressed and anxious. And then unfortunately, I think that negatively influence their brain plasticity during pregnancy, which then leads to more kind of dampen and lower sensitivity to picking up the infant cues in the brain.
So, in terms of these dampened responses overall that you're describing, how does that actually relate to functional outcomes or behaviors?
So what we see like in the past and across the studies is that especially in these brain regions that are important for emotional regulation and empathy, when we see the lower brain activation to infant cues, they tend to be related to more difficulties in providing sensitive care to infants. We're talking about small differences, but still, it seems to be that when brain due to stress have a bit more difficulties in catching up those infant cues, it's probably also causing people's difficulties in like sensitively interpreting and deciding what they're the best next steps to respond. So that's the link that we tend to see, that lower brain responses to infant cues related to lower sensitive behaviors that they might show during interactions with infants.
You found that income gains overall showed a very different pattern than income losses. Can you tell us a little bit about what income gains represented?
The income gains show a opposite pattern of the associations with the brain activations. And the income gain effect was very specific to their own infant cry. So when I mentioned the income losses, the impact of income losses were actually more across both their own baby cry and control baby cry. And we actually saw this in some other studies too, that I think when the stressful experience is so significant, that the impact seems to be broader in the way that the brain's sensitivity is not just very specific to their own baby cry, but like more broadly any infant cry. But when it comes to a different experience of income gains, we can interpret it as more kind of promotive, more supportive experience that seems to have a more specific impact on people's brain response to their own baby cry, and in a way that also the critical brain regions that are important for empathy and emotion regulation. So when people during pregnancy, they had more income gains and had more money over time. That might have actually probably lowered their stress during pregnancy, and they probably feel more secure, more supported. So when it comes to the time that when they have their own babies, their brain seems to be more sensitive, more ready to respond to their baby's cues, which then potentially translate into closer emotional cues, which actually we saw from the survey. So more income gains during pregnancy was related to higher levels of the postnatal emotional attachment to their own baby that participants reported. So, again, kind of showing that financial security, the financial support can be a positive factor, predicting the more positive experience and more positive changes in the brain for becoming parents.
One really interesting finding was that income losses had broader effects on the brain than just consistently low income. What does that tell us about the effects of unpredictability itself rather than just financial hardship?
So that's actually a bit of a surprising finding for us too, because poverty is such powerful experience for some individuals. I wouldn't say I necessarily predicted that income losses have really significant impact, like above and beyond the impact of poverty. But then when I reflected on it, when we had these findings, especially the conversations that we had with pregnant individuals, we found that during the pregnancy, a lot of parents, they're very concerned about their safety, their ability to providing secure environment for their baby. So it's also possible that during pregnancy, this instability, especially losing income, are particularly very, very stressful. And that might be something that's reflected in these findings that it's not just the poverty, but when I cannot predict my income, I don't know what might happen next month because of the income that I just lost. And can I be continue to be providing really supportive environment for myself and for my baby? I think it seems to be very, very stressful for people who are going through that experience.
Do you think you'd have seen the same effects in higher income individuals, or do you think this might be more specific to lower income groups?
So income changes happen more often among lower income people. However, though, in our studies, income losses and infant gains were happening across the socioeconomic status. So the analysis itself was done across all income levels, not just limited to low income. So that means at any income level, these income loss and income gain can have impact on parents' brain sensitivity to infant cues. So when we are actually thinking about some ways to supporting pregnancy, I think it's very important to also consider the people across all income ranges.
Overall, if we identify pregnant individuals who are experiencing income losses, what kind of interventions do you think might help?
So I want to say, while it's very concerning to see how much of the strong impact that income loss has during pregnancy, I think it's encouraging to see that also how income gain has a positive impact. So that I think seems to suggest that if there are some ways that we can help the parents during this period to kind of secure their income. So one example that comes to my mind is parental leave policy is, I think, relatively widely available in different states to ensure this income stability for pregnant parents or also postpartum parents as well. So, if we want to provide the best supportive environment to parents, I think providing a little bit of that security net that they can kind of fall back on would be really great, I think, ways to intervening. The other would be, I think, the clinics and other places can consider screening for income loss as one of the kind of factors that parents are experiencing high levels of stress. Very often we ask about their income levels and some other stressful life experience, but I don't think that we ask a lot about any recent changes in their income. But our study seems to suggesting that at a certain level, that income loss can provide higher levels of stress than the low income itself to the pregnant individuals. Mhm.
So, if there's one key message that you'd want clinicians, researchers, and policymakers to take away from your work, what would that be?
The one take-home message will be that during pregnancy, people can experience income instability, and particularly the income loss they experience during pregnancy can negatively influence their adjustment to parenthood, both at a brain level and also emotional level. So I think it's very important to considering the importance of income and stability in addition to poverty. But also, I think it's very important to consider that income gain can have positive impact for parents and then their readiness to become parents.
That's all for today's episode. Thank you to Dr. Kim for joining us to share her work on the effects of income instability during pregnancy on postpartum outcomes. For our listeners, you can find the full paper in Biological Psychiatry, Cognitive Neuroscience and Neuroimaging, and we'll include the link in our episode description. To learn more about our journals, please visit biologicalpsychiatry.com. You can find the Biological Psychiatry Podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Subscribe now so you don't miss our next episode, and follow us on our social media channels for highlights and updates. Thanks for listening. This podcast is for informational purposes only and does not constitute medical or professional advice. The views expressed are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of the Society of Biological Psychiatry, its family of journals, or its editors. All rights reserved, including those for text and data mining or use in AI systems.